Okay, so why don't I turn it to you for the JML winter issue?
So with that, I'm grateful for all the people I threw it out there and I get yeses. We love that. That's the thing that Belina and I have been shocked with for the last 2 years. We ask and people say yes. It's amazing. This journal issue had been swirling in my head probably for about 3 years in the making. It seems to take me that long to get the idea right. But in my head, I always had Natasha Casey and Spencer Brayton in mind, along with Neil Anderson, because it started probably when we met in Chicago a couple of years ago, and the idea of understanding and figuring out where we are with the media and information literacy, especially since UNESCO chose that name MIL, and we've got people here who can give us some of the background on that, and we have people who have thoughts on all of this. So we need to make sense of it. Is the Journal of Media Literacy? Where are we going with this, and what do we do with this blending of all of these different frameworks, and how do we make it a positive collaboration, because we know that we're all working toward the same goals, coming at it from different ways. And so Natasha and Spencer have already done a lot of that work themselves because they both come from the different fields, one of media studies, and Natasha, and then Spencer comes from information literacy out of the library sciences. And so they've done work with this in a joint class, and a lot of writing about this. So I will turn it over to them. They'll talk a little bit more about the goals for the issue, and then give time for our guests who've joined us to have some time to share their thoughts and discussions. So take it away, Natasha and Spencer.
All right, thanks, Karen, for the intro. Morning, evening, wherever you are, to everybody. We're delighted and honored to co-guest edit the upcoming issue. I think what we wanted to do first is just give you a little background on ourselves and how we ended up researching and working together, because I think it illustrates some of the challenges, but also some of the, I guess, opportunities of working across our siloed disciplinary areas. So I think it's almost a decade ago now, Spencer, is it, that we first stumbled into each other? We were at the same institution, fairly newly arrived at a college here in the middle of the US. And I'd been trained, my background is media studies, cultural studies. I was trained in England first. And so David, it's a real honor to be on a call with you. It was your work was mandatory reading for me back in the day, along with Len Masterman and several others. And so that was my background. So Spencer and I then, like I said, met and stumbled into each other and presented this class that I'd been working on, called Media Literacy, which I managed to make part of the Gen Ed curriculum, only because I think nobody knew what it was. But lots of people like to complain about how students were on social media all the time, and can we please do something about that? And I'm like, sure, I can do something about that. And so then Spencer looked at my class and said, wait a minute, there's a lot of overlap here between media literacy and information literacy. And I have to say, my ideas of what information literacy were, I had a lot of misconceptions, outdated ideas, about card catalogs and what librarians do, and I really wasn't up on the field. So learning through him, and then going to various conferences and starting to write about our experience of working together, collaborating together, we start to learn about each other's fields. What a shocking idea, right? That you might step outside of your own field in academia. This is a radical thought. So Spencer, I've been going on enough. Come on, jump in here.
You took it all. Yeah, I think sort of what I was up against at the previous institution that Natasha and I were at, and why this collaboration happened, is there's sort of outdated notions about what libraries and librarians do, I think. Not being sort of repositories and spaces just for books, but for education and learning outside of the classroom as well. And I think Natasha, I think, saw that. I think you regularly incorporated some type of instruction from the library in your courses. But I boldly asked, I think, to see your syllabus before I think I engaged. And sort of that's where I saw some crossover between some frameworks and things done outside of the library world here in the US and what outcomes and things, resources you were using in your class. And at the same time, I had piloted an information literacy course at the same institution. And so those sorts of things just kind of continued our dialogue together as well. And I think it was actually probably, I think, fall of 2014 that we taught the class together for the first time. We actually worked through the syllabus, worked through the course content, I think, over summer break, and sort of redid the class that way.
One of the things that we found shocking at the time was we went to look for other models, right? Surely if UNESCO has produced this, handbook about how to incorporate these two ideas, surely there must be loads of models. And we could only find one other existing class. And I'm sure our search wasn't exhaustive, but I think our challenge of trying to find another model really says something about that's a whole nother debate in academia of how we're completely siloed, but also just a lack of awareness, I think. From my perspective, media studies, communication scholars very poorly, and I would include myself in this, up to date about what was going on in the information sciences world. And I think where we started to see the most crossover, I think, is in what is typically referred to as critical media literacy in the US. And we saw a similar branch here in the United States and Canada of critical information literacy. And we saw a lot of crossover between those two in terms of theoretical frameworks, theoretical influences, all kinds of things there. So,
I just want to say quick on that. Like, I had this moment of, what the hell am I doing as a librarian if I'm teaching to a database? And so I had this sort of moment of like, am I going to have to leave this field because this isn't fun, right? We're paying these folks to sort of aggregate all this information for us, and then I'm just sort of almost reciting back what that company and how they're sharing and make that information accessible for folks. So it was almost like, as a librarian, I was like questioning what I was doing, and so it was really sort of that critical application. Again, that I saw the crossover between what we're doing, and really sort of saw sort of more value and sort of increased, how the impact that librarian as educator can have in the classroom. So I just wanted to mention that piece in terms of the critical aspect, Natasha.
Yeah, the last thing I would say is in terms of this journal, so that's sort of our background, where we came from. One of the reasons I'm excited to work on this journal is I think since legislation was brought in Illinois a couple of years ago that mandated media literacy education for high schoolers in the state, that teachers are struggling. Where do I go? How can I have to have some component of media literacy. Of course, it's not specified. Legislators passed this, legislation without really specifying what it should involve. And so I think teachers are scrambling. In fact, I know teachers are scrambling. And so we see, a link between librarians and faculty, whether it's on the college level or the K through 12 level. That's a great strategic partnership. And I think we need to explore and investigate and make aware, the crossover between. Now, it doesn't mean we're in simpatico with everything, right? But there's enough crossover, I think, to really help, I think, teachers, wrap their heads around what media literacy is by joining forces with librarians. So when we were thinking about the audience for this issue, and we were talking with Karen and Neil about it, I think one of the things is that we wanted to make it more accessible. There's plenty of places where you can find the traditional research for this kind of topic, but there's not a lot of spaces for other outlets. So I'm really excited so far from having talked with lots of people who haven't submitted yet. I'm hoping they're probably like us. It's 12 hours to go and you better get something in quick. So I anticipate not seeing a whole lot of movement until later in June. But yeah, that idea of making the work accessible, I think, is really important, and introducing teachers to the ways in which they can utilize the library and information literacy more broadly to inform their conceptions of media literacy. So that's a real goal that we have for the issue. I see a hand. Yeah, go ahead, Alexander.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. Just to say that what the U.S. Embassy called the American spaces, and we have here the Thomas Edison Library in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. They are implementing some projects on information literacy that merge in the practical way with media literacy or media education. So at the same time, there are some publications important. Myself, I wrote a book 10 years ago that I tried to, experience that I was doing within the network of schools, merging this thing, but it's not available in English. What I do think, and Spencer too, I'm talking to you too, sorry, is that we have, and when I was at UNESCO, I realized that we had to have a lot of material, not in English or Spanish, but in local language that's spread around the world, of local experience, and maybe local or maybe national frameworks that merge those two fields, or even experiences. So it's a pity that it's not translated, because I've been globetrotting, as everyone here, all around, and I see some experience, but sometimes they are not systematic. They are not written. Nobody written about it, or the academia don't look at it as something interesting. But just to take a look at that American space, because, for example, when you do a hackathon, they do a kind of hackathon that merge on that experience with the youth of some schools. They merge on that Thomas Edison libraries and do hackathons to be this information using some aspects of information literacy and media literacy together. So maybe the U.S. Embassy or Consulate, or the State Department, where I've been last month in Washington, they are trying maybe to touch this somehow.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I think so. I mean, the State Department now is well involved, as we know, both here and in many places abroad, in all kinds of sometimes problematic ways, of course, as well. So one of our goals, to make it more accessible, to make it obviously international, is another element. So we've been reaching out to lots of people across the globe. The formats, I think, is a real key, and I think that's got a lot of people excited, hopefully. Without talking some more, I think it would be good to bring in some of the guests that we have today and hear from them.
Good. Okay, I will be super brief. I mean, I'm here because I saw your call for contributions, Natasha and Spencer, and I thought, well, I've already done a blog on that, and I thought it would be useful to put that piece together with some responses. I mean, I wrote the blog to provoke, to stir things up, to stir up a discussion, and I thought it might be useful then for the journal to host that discussion, or a continuing discussion. I'm assuming that people might have looked at that, or at least kind of given it a quick skim. So I'm just going to pick out a few kind of quick questions from it, really. I guess what concerns me is a rather hasty kind of blurring together of media and information literacy. And I wanted to generally ask the question, well, yes, okay, on one level, this seems to make sense, but on another level, what are the tensions, the possible contradictions? What gets left out, or can potentially be left out, when we talk about MIL, media and information literacy? So in the blog, I started off just asking this question: what is information? Because there's a kind of history to all of this, and you can go back. I think I put a link into a really interesting another blog post that I read, which kind of tracks back this concept of information really to 1950s, you know, the rise of cybernetics, and some of the debates going on around that time. And I think what that piece was doing, and what I would also want to do in a way, is to question a bit the what is potentially a kind of technocratic, instrumental approach to information in all of that. There is a danger, or there has historically been a danger, of seeing information as some kind of neutral good, you know, a tool, if you like, something that you know, that has benefits, and the more of it we have, the better we will be. And I think that also plays a bit to the present. So I think there may be a value in looking back to the 50s. And I think if you could get somebody to write a piece about that history in the journal, it would be really interesting. But I think as you kind of bring it forward to the present, you know, we're still in the wake of this whole debate about information versus disinformation or misinformation. It's really, we're in the wake of the so-called fake news discussion, and the assumption there, which I've ranted about on my blog from time to time, about, you know, the assumption that we can easily distinguish between what's fake and what's true, or we can have, you know, we can distinguish between bad information and good information. And this is all very straightforward. And I guess I want to say that it isn't straightforward. It's not straightforward kind of politically. It's not straightforward pedagogically, if that's what you're trying to do in the classroom. And I think another question that I did raise there around this notion of information is, well, you know, what isn't information? I mean, you know, what kinds of things are we kind of including in that term? Potentially, in a way, the world is full of information, and we might want to blur that with another term, data. And we're very aware that the world is full of data, and people busily kind of mining and stealing and appropriating data. So I think there's a kind of in principle discussion to have, and perhaps a relatively theoretical discussion about what we mean by this term information and how useful it is. Second thing would be, well, you know, what is information literacy? And part of it, again, is, you know, a familiar skepticism I have about this endless extension of the term literacy, or this pluralization of literacies, so everything becomes a literacy, at which point I think that the term ceases to be especially useful. And I think also my reading of it, and, you know, it may be that I'm completely out of date with all of this, but my sense is that information literacy is often understood in quite functional terms. So just as there is a functional definition of literacy, which sees it as a set of kind of atomized skills that people can acquire and be trained in and then apply, there is a similar kind of argument around information literacy. And I think that's problematic. I think when we talk about media literacy, we're not using literacy in quite that sense. So I wanted to kind of raise that question. I am aware, and, you know, I came across and had come across before Natasha and Spencer's work, and then other people's work around this. I mean, it seems to me, yes, there absolutely is a critical notion of information literacy, or media and information literacy. But it seems to me one of the big kind of distinctions is that, you know, that would not be a functional notion of literacy. It would be a very different kind of conception of literacy as being about critical and cultural understanding. For me, I would say at the end of the day, media literacy seems to me to be something broader than information literacy. I don't have a problem with the two things being in adjacent spaces. But my sense is that once we start talking about media and information literacy, we tend to focus on factual media. A lot of the discussion gets to be about news and propaganda and advertising and so on. And my question is, you know, a familiar and obvious one. Well, where is fiction in all of that? Where is popular culture in all of that? So a lot of the things that we think of as absolutely basic to media literacy, once we start talking about media and information literacy, some of those things might be pushed into the background a bit. Final thing to say, I think, is that, obviously, if you read to the end of the blog, you will see the thing that provoked me, really, was that NATO report. And I'm interested that, you mentioned the State Department and all of this. I mean, what this indicates to me is that this notion of information literacy is profoundly political, perhaps particularly at the moment. And I think that NATO report really, to me, showed the problem, because what it's talking about is about media literacy as a weapon in a global information war. And that, it seemed to me, is politically and in many other ways quite different from what my conception of literacy would be. If we're looking to what we're doing as really supporting NATO, the US State Department in a war against misinformation, which is assumed to come from other places and never from NATO or the US government, then I really have a problem with that. So that was my aim, really. I mean, I think I wanted to kind of raise some problems, and part of it is a more general sense that it would be good to have some forthright debate around media literacy. I think there tends to be a bit of a sense that we all know what we're talking about. We're all talking about the same thing. I think there's a bit of a danger of a kind of false consensus appearing, and this in particular seemed to me to be something I could just have a bit of a push at. So that's me.
I'm just, thank you for that, actually, David, but I appreciate that, because I think the weaponization piece kind of falls into the same sphere as the inoculization piece that people are, terming, which makes me absolutely crazy. So I think that's actually really interesting. And just to add to the piece about the NATO report, I've now traveled to 3 places where that NATO report has come into contentious conversations. I wish actually Tessa was here in many ways, because of how countries were represented, or in some cases, people felt misrepresented within the report in the idea of media and information literacy, which is really interesting as well. I do think there is a false consensus problem that we have to address. And this is a perfect time, actually, within the journal, and maybe as part of the editorial sphere, to really have that conversation sort of fleshed out a bit. And maybe even putting that question out there and not allowing people to respond, like as an open question, to be added into the journal, where people can, really deliberate their opinion, their side, the way that they see it, and then contribute that thinking. I don't want to take from the other speakers, but thank you very much, David, for that. I think that was actually right on in terms of some of the concerns that have been coming up quite a bit. Karen, did you have someone in line that you wanted to?
I say we go with Pierre and Normand next, and then open it up for discussion. So I think it flows beautifully into their work. So.
Okay, good. Thank you, Karen. Karen asked us to summarize the findings from our meta review, and Normand and I agree that I would do the summary and then he would jump in into the discussion. Normand, if you change your mind, just mute my mic and take over. I will happily leave the reins to you. Geraldine Wakens, the first author of the paper, could not make it today, and she wanted us to excuse her. So I needed to mention that. So as I said, I will talk briefly about what we stated in the paper. It's a full journal paper. The first time I presented it in a conference about 3 months ago in Vancouver, I managed to shorten it to 9 minutes. I will attempt to do it in 5 minutes today. So obviously a lot of the details of the paper will get lost in the conversion. So just to help me go fast through the main points of the paper, maybe if I can share my screen, and I will reuse the slides that I used at the Global Media Education Summit. I see that it seems to be working. Okay, good. And so you will see that there are a number of QR codes in the slides I will be using. I haven't taken the time to prepare new slides for this presentation. I apologize. Do not try to use these QR codes. They don't work anymore. It's just useless. So we did a meta review of literature reviews discussing the concepts of media literacy, information literacy, and digital literacy. I will not go over the technical details of the meta review, but I want to concentrate mostly on the findings and then on the recommendations that we formulated based on these findings. So again, these findings are not things that we came up with. They're just, you know, a summary of the reviews of the literature that we analyzed as part of this meta review. And the first set of findings has to do with what I would call the conceptual state of media literacy, information literacy, and digital literacy. And it actually can be summarized into 3 points. One, most authors of these reviews state that there is a proliferation of concepts. There are dozens of literacy concepts that authors who propose these concepts are prone to assume that there is an implicit consensus on their definitions, or to propose definitions without going back to prior definitions or prior models of media literacy, digital literacy, or information literacy, and that this overlap with older concepts is regularly overlooked. There is a lack of shared definitions. It's often difficult to identify the types of abilities or skills or knowledge or practices that are covered by these literacies. And there is even not a consensus on whether literacies or literacy should be defined in terms of abilities or in terms of culture or in terms of social practice, for example. There is a persistent disagreement on these definitions, and the very desirability of the consensus is a matter of discussion in itself. There's what we call a problematic or at least a potentially problematic interdisciplinarity in the field, in the way that definitions come from a wide array of disciplinary or interdisciplinary background. Collaboration between disciplines is seen as a necessity, but there is a lack of explicitation of where these definitions come from in terms of disciplinary posture or disciplinary background. And so while these postures are left implicit, it kind of prevents the critical appraisal of the convergences or divergences between these definitions. The second set of findings has to do with the way these definitions and models can be operationalized in relationship to the practice of media education. And most reviews that we reviewed point to a necessity of operationalizing these definitions in the sense of establishing connections between the definitions and actual either measures for observing and assessing abilities related to literacy or media literacy, digital literacy, or information literacy, or to making more connections with the design of actual educational actions that are likely to develop such abilities. So based on these findings, we formulated 2 general requirements in terms of recommendations. The first one is that research contributions should be explicit about their theoretical and disciplinary approaches. And the second one is that they should explore in greater depth the issue of operationalization of these conceptual tools. So to be a little more specific here, what we wanted to say is, 1, definitions should provide some kind of explanation of the disciplinary anchoring or background and the scientific communities of reference for the proposed definition. This would allow for a critical appraisal of the relationship between these definitions. 2, that what is meant by literacy in terms of, is it a form of culture, is it social practices, is it competencies, skills, knowledge, should also be defined explicitly. 3, the qualifier that accompanies or that qualifies the literacy being defined should also be defined. So a lot of the times in a lot of the literature, when we talk about media literacy, for example, media is not specifically being defined, or information, and David reminded us that information could be defined in many different ways and sometimes in very reductive ways. Information is also not being systematically defined. And then 4th, the type of definition being proposed should also be made more specific. Is it what James Potter called an umbrella definition, or a definition of the literacy development process, a definition of the literacy's ultimate purpose, a definition of its internal structure? All of these things can can take the definition of a given literacy into a different direction. And then finally, in line with the last findings in the paper, we proposed for definitions of media literacy, information literacy, or digital literacy to examine the possible operationalization of the concept into a number of things, among which assessment tools, educational resources, teaching methods, and really the intention is here to recommend that theoretical work be more more deeply connected to the work of the practice of media education. Two of the things that came out of the discussion we had in Vancouver when I first presented these findings and recommendations were, I think, worth mentioning here. The first one was that a sixth recommendation could be to specify or make explicit the cultural context in which a definition was proposed, or from which the definition came, and this to try to limit the way in which Northern or Western definitions or models of literacy might actually make definitions from other parts of the world less visible. And then the other point of discussion was about, and I think this was a misconstruction of what we meant, probably because I had to go too fast in the discussion, that the risk of what we recommended was to go towards a standardization of literacy definitions. This is absolutely not what we meant. We really meant for the diversity of definitions to be put forward and to be put into discussion. And so our intention is not for media literacy and information literacy and digital literacy scholars to agree on one single standardized definition once and for all, but to put it into discussion and into critical discussion. So I will leave it at that. Thank you for your attention. I hope this will feed into the discussion nicely. We'll see with that in a couple of minutes, I guess.
One of the things that we actually found is that there's a tendency in the field of bringing new concepts and meta literacies without taking into account in a proper manner previous work that have been done 15, 20 years ago. So there's also this idea that the field is full of work that is slowly getting disappearing and not having the recognition, or at least the integrations in the most recent work on various concepts of literacies.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, all of that's really interesting. I absolutely recognize what you're saying. It's, yes, a sad and familiar story. I wanted to just add one other kind of dimension into the discussion, which is about policy, really. I mean, one reason we're having this discussion is because of UNESCO. It's not the only reason, but the fact that UNESCO is now talking about MIL means that we've also got to talk about MIL or figure out where we stand in relation to MIL. And again, there's a history here. You know, I am old enough to remember that UNESCO was talking about media education in the 1970s. There's actually a book that was published at the end of the 70s about media education. Probably before that, certainly talking again in the 90s. At the beginning of the 2000s, I was actually asked by UNESCO to do some work for them on media literacy policy, partly to produce a kind of policy paper, but also to produce some materials for teachers and students, which I did, but it was quite an odd experience, really. I mean, it seemed to me to be that there was no institutional memory, and that I'm partly provoked by what Normand just said. You know, that they had no idea really that they were asking me to do something that had actually been done 10 years ago and 20 years before that. And on one level, and I mean, I'm slightly trivializing here, but it also seemed to me that partly this was about office politics. You know, you couldn't go back to what people had done before. You had to have something new. And also, interestingly to me, the guy I was dealing with kept talking about youth. So this was about education and youth. And I think it was partly that the chairs in the office had moved around. And so he had responsibility for youth as well as education. So what I was doing had to also be talking about youth rather a lot. And that seemed to me to be, I mean, on one level, it makes perfect sense, but on another level, it was kind of a bit arbitrary. And I wonder whether now media information literacy, that combination, comes about partly because of the institutional imperatives of UNESCO as an organization, that it needs to put together what it's doing and position itself politically. Because, let's be clear, we tend to think of UNESCO as this kind of beneficent cultural organization. Well, it's not. It's a political player in the world, and it's not innocent in any of this. And there are reasons why they're arguing what they're arguing, and they're pushing the kind of policy that they want to be pushing. So, I mean, I honestly don't know what is going on now. So I ask this as a question, which is partly, why are we talking about this now? Or why is UNESCO talking about this now? And again, I think that would be something that would be very interesting to have discussed in the journal.
Carolyn, did you want to jump in on this? Because I actually would like to too, but I'm actually trying to hold myself back. So go ahead, Carolyn.
Sure. I'll just make a couple of quick comments, David, in response to what you've shared. I also find it very interesting at UNESCO that media and information literacy is only positioned in the communication and information sector. It hasn't been, not to say that there isn't work happening in digital citizenship in that area, in the education sector, but primarily it's sort of owned by communication and information, and not actually education at all, not in a formal sense, not in the way we're talking about it being embraced and promoted by UNESCO. So I just wanted to add that as well, that I've always found that sort of an interesting situation. And it seems to me in some ways that, the sectors don't communicate either, really. There isn't much integration among them or between them. So I find that sort of an interesting dilemma, and I think really an obstacle in terms of moving work forward and creating resources and policy documents that are effective and useful. I'll stop there, although I could go on.
Well, just a quick response on that, because what you're describing is very familiar, and it is absolutely the story of media literacy policy in the UK, which is that the ministry, this became a policy. It was sort of flavor of the month in 2003 with a new Communications Act. The Ministry of Education, Department for Education, didn't want to know anything, didn't want to have anything to do with it. It was Ofcom, the media regulator. And I think once it becomes something for, in that case, media regulation or communication policy without reference to education, then it serves particular functions. Things get missed in all of this. So I think it's a really important point to pursue.
Yeah. And just to add to this is actually a same issue with the US State Department, where different pieces of the US State Department are doing media literacy, and they do not speak to each other and don't know that the other is doing something similar, which is incredibly troublesome, and which actually also breaks down the continuity of the work, to be perfectly honest. Alex, I see your hand is up too. Did you want to add?
The problem is going to be tougher now, Mr. Buckingham, because the AI is a reality now, and AI is stuck in a department of human science, UNESCO. It doesn't dialogue with any other pilot. And that was my recent research in at the Pontifical Catholic University here in Brazil, was AI and media education, which is, I think, it's the way it takes place in basic education, and they are not. But this is a systemic problem with governments, universities, and multilateral organisms. It's not a particular problem of UNESCO. Just to have an idea, Belinha just just anticipate what I was about to tell. I'm having a lot of talks with the U.S. Department because we host an event now here. We're gonna host another in August, and they are like scattered. The concept is scattered all around the State Department. You know, you cannot, and they work of media education. Here in Brazil, they talk about media literacy in this. They don't use literacy as a concept. They prefer the harder to use education. And on the other hand, they are drinking into Rhode Island, Rene Rob's perspective of the concept, which is a different perspective of the concept too. So there are concepts that's going through. I don't think, for example, MIL, Belin and Karen probably would address this better than me, but I don't think the concept of MIL is too strong in the United States as it is in Europe, for example. I'm leaving the International Steering Committee of the UNESCO this month, and I took Carolyn's place on the same position. So we are talking about someone who were looking through all the experience. I don't think MIL is too strong, for example, I don't know in Canada, Carolyn speaks better than me, but in the US, I don't see the US, the State Department talking about MIL. I've never heard this. I heard about media education and a very confused concept and scattered at the same time.
I'm going to add to that, I think in part it has to do with the fact the American Library Association doesn't embrace MIL either. I think they try. They've had a couple of meetings that they've tried to, and both Spencer and Natasha, we've been at events where there's this attempt to embrace both, and yet very much a separation between the people who are in the room. And it's clear who the difference, who's in the library world, who's in the media education world, and then the few of us that sit together who understand why the crossover is happening, sit together to try to explain why the crossover is there, which is problematic in and of itself.
I'm going to say, I think some of the points that are raised here, I was busy scribbling notes, but they're really great and really going to help inform this issue. But I'm always struck by this discussion about what, define media, define information. And a number of people have talked about these two things as sort of two sides of the same coin. But I think delving into that history a little bit more, as I think it was David who suggested that, I think would be quite informative for the issue if we could get somebody to write about that. I mean, Marcus Leaning has written about that in the past. I know he's talked about maybe contributing. I've chatted with him. I think actually even Sonia Livingston and Renee Hobbs have both talked about this, about how media and information are so closely aligned that it's hard to differentiate between the two. So teasing out some of those debates, I think could be really useful. Although I am sort of at the same time aware of how far into the theoretical weeds we could get on the one hand, and that appeals. Like I love that part, right? But I'm not sure if we're really trying to focus on, or if this issue is really trying to reach a different kind of audience, how fascinating that might be from not an insider's point of view. So just things rattling around in my head. Not really any point there.
No, but I think it's actually, it's a really good point. I think you have to still address the elephant in the room, because it's always the elephant in the room. And so why not have it right on the onset? This is what it is, and this is the problem, and we'll go from there.
My question really was about this whole concept of the Global South being, again, kind of excluded in the whole conversation, in the so-called global conversation. But then, because you already said this, that whether it's UNESCO or any other kind of a body, it is political at the end of the road. It's not necessarily cultural, or, and then there's cultural politics. So when it comes to politics in the Global South, if you look at my country, which is India, or Alex's country until recently, we've had our tryst with what used to be called authoritarianism. I want to go a little further and call it autocracy. And so when I look at the so-called media literacy efforts in India, which are all but non-existent except for, workshops and so forth, how can we relate democracy to media literacy? Or are we taking something for granted here in terms of what kind of governance is necessary as a prerequisite for media literacy.
Yes, I absolutely recognize what you're saying, and we're in a world where the likes of Donald Trump or Narendra Modi can talk about fake news and misinformation, and they can throw that charge around. So we're in a very difficult place with all of this, and I think a much more complex and difficult place than perhaps we were in 30, 40 years ago. I guess what it throws up for me is, again, very familiar line, but media literacy is not going to solve all the problems of the world. And if we're talking about misinformation or fake news or whatever term you want to use, or if we're talking about what I think kind of underlies the bigger underlying problem in a way is about trust in government. Yes, because I think in many countries, I mean, we are the last people to speak in England, let me tell you. In many countries, distrust in government is at really historically high levels, and people's belief in conspiracy theory. There was a story in the newspapers only yesterday. Very high levels of belief in just the most bizarre conspiracies, very high level of kind of cynicism about information about politicians and so on. And I think what that all tells us is that, these are very, very deep-seated political problems. They are not, and I think I said this in the blog, they are not just problems with information, as though we had some sort of pollution in the water supply, and then we got some kind of way of filtering or some chemical that would solve the problem of pollution in the information supply, and then everything would be all right again, because actually it's a much more fundamental problem than that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of research some years ago about the similarities and differences of media literacy and information literacy. And I think for the current, we are now moving into a very different world, different, media environment. And I think it is time for media scholars and to work together with librarians. I think they can learn from each other, because from my research, in the past 40 years, the media literacy scholars and, for media literacy is basically operated by communication scholars and education scholars. And for information, literacy, it is operated by the information science scholars. And they didn't talk to each other much in the past 40 years. And they are two very different disciplines. But actually, according to my research, they have a lot of common goals, such as how to train people to assess, understand, evaluate, and communicate and create messages. But they have different focuses. For example, for information literacy scholars, they focus more on the peer-reviewed and publications, books, databases. But for media scholars, we focus more on media messages and media products and news. And for analysis, for the information, literacy scholars, they only use textual analysis and focus on relevancy of sources, accuracy of the information. But for our communication scholars or media literacy scholars, we also concerned about the hidden ideologies and values. So both sides, have their focus. And I think it is time for us to hold hand in hand and to have a more integrated and in a holistic way to face the complicated information environments. So to me, a media information literate person should be able to handle messages from all different sources, not only internet and mass media, but also libraries, museums, archives, databases. So I think it is time for, both, disciplines, they learn from each other and hold hand in hand, to train our citizens as well as the young people, to face the new technologies. Particularly, we are moving into AI eras. And actually, in the coming years, I think we are not only worked with libraries, media scholars, but also computer science scholars as well. So I think, for example, libraries, for media literacy, we very often operate in school settings where our focus on students, young people. But library, I think they should train media literacy person or media information literacy person for all citizens. I think library can do that. So that's why I think we should work together. I think that would be a good thing. So that is what I want to share.
I will speak fast. And Alice, you captured what I've been thinking. I just think that we're beyond, at this point, these differentiations that only people like us who love the scholarly analysis are doing, to do something that is wider and broader. These are public policy issues. The AI issues, which I've been following very closely, are already tearing groups apart and coming from places where we have not heard a word about media literacy. There are new sources, there are new platforms. I just feel we have to be much larger in our thinking and integrative. And I wrote an article for Bellina's new book on the future of media literacy, and it was about 2 years ago. And so much has already changed, even though I still stand by the principles there. But we're looking at new centers of innovation, new theoretical models, and particularly a kind of, I feel, a global convening. I think we are global in this room, and we have got to see these as global issues. I think I think we need to talk to each other, and we need to find a systematic way, because these, to me, are systemic issues. Like I heard on NPR this morning that Illinois, the state of Illinois, has banned the banning of books. It is the first state in the country that is refusing to allow for the banning of books. And yet, if we know the American situation, they're banning everything, not only books, but the whole curriculum. And, media literacy falls in that political context. So without going into too much detail now, I wish that there could be something of all of the brilliance that's in this room in an integrated way, and that we say we are going to convene, we're going to take the next 2 years, we're going to come up with some new thoughts about how both, if it's for teaching in schools, that's one thing. If it's about, we have to see who our audiences are. There's not one audience for this. And it is political, but it's beyond political. It's also the way we live now. Everyone here communicates in so many different ways and to so many different audiences. So this is not A, B, C, D, E, but I just hope that we can convene, that we can get larger, integrated, be more systems thinking in our work, and come up with something that helps and benefits humanity, I guess. Because I think we're in tough shape now, and I don't think we can play small games at this point.
Yeah, no, I mean, nothing to say. I wish you good luck. I do have to run now, but I think what would be very nice in the journal is to have, as you proposed, really, a range of different formats. So actually, setting up debate, having some scholarly pieces, but having a range of different formats for pieces would be really good. So, I mean, I'm happy to contribute, or I will have a think about who I think I know. I have read something a while ago with somebody who's written about that thing about the history of information, and I think there's something I could probably put you in touch with. So, I mean, by all means, keep in touch.
Before you leave, though, can I just want to know, how would you all feel about this sort of as a intro preliminary to your journal, this conversation that we're having today? Just, it's so interesting to hear perspectives, and maybe it comes as part of the beginning of, this is sort of where the idea germinated to where we sort of began the debate, and then leads off into the other parts of the conversation. Just a thought.
I think there's loads of threads here that will inform. Yeah, there's plenty of space to do that. Okay. I think. Yeah.
Well, we will definitely be in touch, David. Thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate your thoughts, and we will see you again. We'll be in touch.
Cheers.
And thank you. And
thanks,
so
David.
Now it's a matter of, where are we going? I guess there's so much here. I keep writing notes of things that I think are super important. In fact, I just sent a note to Karen saying I wasn't planning on contributing to the journal, but now I think I am, because I have something I think I want to really say about this piece. But I think that it says something to the conversation, though, that just happened, where there are so many parts of this that I think sort of lead to why it's a little broken, and also why it's somehow together, in a very interesting way.
I think one other piece of this is where the funding comes from. When you look for at academic organizations here in the United States, maybe and across the world, and you're talking a lot about UNESCO and others in the State Department, but a lot of the funding comes here from private foundations and other groups, and they are very much at this point, as far as my corner of the world is affected, influenced by politics and by the cultural environment right now. And information literacy is a very hot topic politically, and is getting a lot of funding, whereas media literacy is not seen in the same way. When we're talking about fake news and all the rest, that's the hot topic today. And funding, unfortunately, is important in trying to drive an issue to the top of the agenda, from my perspective. And also, I'd like to say one other thing, that we're talking about blending of the two groups. We have here in Washington, we have teacher librarians, and I think there are teacher librarians across the country who do try to blend the two, information literacy and media literacy, although the teacher librarians know much more about information literacy, and it's been a real objective of ours here to teach them how media literacy is such an important part of what they need to do, because there is that position in many schools.
Marilyn, I appreciate what you said. I also think, honestly, I almost feel like the fake news piece, which put media literacy in somewhat respects on the map, has also created incredible amounts of damage for us as well, because that's literally the only lens by which people see the work of media literacy. And that is not the work of media literacy. It's just an aspect. So, it's troubling because it comes up too often, unfortunately, but thank you for that.
I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting how we're now starting to distinguish between media and information literacy, because as though they were different, media is one thing, which is more of an instrument, whereas information is the actual product of it. But so I take that problematic in that sense that we need to almost equate information with mediated information as of today. And that's how we're pretending that that's what's happening. But at the same time, at the pedagogic levels, we're distinguishing the two, where information, for example, in the undergrad course that I taught, which was called Media and Information Literacy, the information literacy part was taught by somebody else, and I taught the media literacy part. And then, of course, the media literacy part had copious amounts of fake news related content. But then information literacy was more about the kind of the upstream, which is how to build information and how to treat information and to create information, albeit mediated. So we teach them how to create this information. So as if we are trying to build a generation for the future, which is so media literate that it knows how to create these nuggets of information themselves, so they were not going to be fooled by fake news. I think this whole thing is a false premise in that media literacy is far deeper in terms of just look at access. And because I come from the global South, I have a I'm particularly troubled by the idea that media literacy is not about access anymore. David was just talking about trust, for example. Trust is the problem, not mistrust. Trust is the problem. That is to say that people are trusting what comes to them since they cannot see what doesn't come to them, for example. So the trust and not the mistrust is the problem. And we're not recognizing that enough in our media literacy. And so because the media hold the key to information. And of course, with everything that was mentioned before, with the structures and so forth, and including the UNESCO kind of structures, we are blinded by that so much that we're not paying attention to what is invisible to us. And only media literacy programs can correct that. And yet, when we go to the global South, how do we gain access to communities without being watched over by hawk-like structures, which prevent us from doing that? So that's where I was coming from earlier as well, Belina. Sorry for the long-winded.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Shashi. I think this is all part of the conversation of how we're going to break this down and look at it in a bigger scope.
I just wanted to say, Shashi, I really appreciate the comment that you made and just the reminder as we focus on these topics and definitions and the institutions like UNESCO who've been a force or a presence in shaping some of what we're doing, to look at what's not being addressed or included as well, especially when we have had really a strong presence. I'll use UNESCO as the example, sort of shaping conferences, discussion, opportunities. I think your point really resounded with me to make sure we look at what isn't being addressed and what's been left out. And this was echoed certainly in earlier comments as well, looking more holistically at the field. Belina, you just made this comment rather, made this point, not focusing only on specific topics like disinformation, but recognizing that the field is much broader than that. And there may be issues and perspectives that have sort of fallen by the wayside because of the way that media and information literacy has been prioritized in some regions, in some sectors. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
And just, Spencer, I'm sorry, I'm going to just jump in really quickly. And just to broaden that omission piece, which I think is actually one of those fundamental core questions of media literacy anyway, we aren't looking at all the sectors. In this space, we are media and information literacy people here, media education people. We aren't looking at the health sector. We're not looking at how engineers look at this, or as someone mentioned earlier, Alice, I think the computer science people. We are already creating an omission in the fact that we don't have this other inclusatory, or even having this conversation, just even the open conversation that stretches out to that. Because educators are in this space, either one area or the other, but we don't recognize some of the other avenues of this, which I think is something, I mean, certainly Karen and I look at this in terms of the work of the whole of IC4ML, but it is something that is still missing. We tend to talk to each other and not outside. So I appreciate that, Carolyn. Spencer, go ahead. I know you wanted to jump in there.
I just want to say real quick, because this came up in a side conversation at the summit in Vancouver. Like, from my perspective, right, this work is not about ignoring the histories of these different areas, right? We're sort of respecting them, but see opportunities to work together, to have them have sort of those commonalities be more powerful together. So I think I just wanted to mention that in terms of this discussion directly, because I think it's come up now, I think a couple of times, and I kind of see it here again as we're all talking about these different areas again. So I just wanted to address that.
Thank you, Spencer. It's been a very busy year, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Karen, did you want to add anything in there?
Please share the call for proposals is until June 30th. So now that your brains are awakened and you're going, oh my gosh, I know who should be in on this debate or talk, or, please share what you can so that we get more voices in the journal. And we definitely will continue with more conversations that will come out of this. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. And Pierre and Normand, I can't wait to see what you're doing next. So thank you for sharing today. I think your work, I think we have to figure out some way to share your work in our journal, because I think it's very valuable.
It was excellent. Thank you. All right, everyone, with that, have a wonderful summer. I hope actually Denise she's in winter. So usually we have someone from Australia who's having the opposite season than us, but we do wish you all well. And thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to speaking with you again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everybody.